Three, two, one. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Skills for Mars podcast. I'm here with Kristof Kovacs. He's a doctor in experimental psychology from the University of Cambridge. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, currently a research fellow, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Psychology of the University of Hungary, Eotvos Lorand University.
Yes,
I hope I'm
indeed.
pronouncing that right. Welcome to the podcast, Kristof.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you as well for joining, especially because this is a new podcast series, right? And we are talking about skills for the future. I think we started 3 weeks ago. We had just released the third episode, and thanks for accepting to share with everyone your knowledge and research on intelligence. I think it's something we should be discussing about.
And again, thank you for inviting me.
Kristof, so I tried to present you with what you're doing, what you're studying, and where you're working right now. But if you could tell us a bit about yourself and how you got to study intelligence, how you got to study psychology, intelligence, a bit about your research, that would be really nice as an introduction.
Oh, it's a tough question, actually. I was hoping for easier ones. I'd say having always a hard time when I have to answer why I study intelligence. It's fascinating, isn't it? But by training, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and in most of cognitive psychology, individual differences are not of very high value as a research area. So in psychology, individual differences are usually dealt with by personal psychologists or industrial organizational psychologists in the applied field and so on. But in academia, I mean, in basic research, it's mostly personality psychology, and of course the field of intelligence, which is a field on its own. So that's different from most areas of cognitive psychology. If you think about like areas like decision making, vision, speech perception, and so on. These areas focus on what's common, people, rather than what makes some
Them
people
different.
different from one another.
Mhm.
So in that respect, individual intelligence is very different. But intelligence is a field for a lot of historical reasons. By historical, I mean history of science. It's separate from mainstream cognitive psychology, and it focuses on application in many ways. And of course, psychometrics is a whole area built on psychological measurement of cognitive abilities, with much less focus on actually understanding and explaining differences. Cognitive psychology, which on the other hand is focused on understanding and explaining cognitive phenomena, is less interested in individual differences. So it's in between two large fields, really, and it makes it. It's one of the things that makes it fascinating. I think
Mhm.
that it's under researched, at least from a cognitive perspective, and it's also fascinating. I mean, people differ in their cognitive abilities, and it's really interesting what makes people differ.
Different.
Yeah.
So I understand that this interest and this under research happening in cognitive psychology is what drove you to study intelligence.
I'm not
Or
sure what drove me. It just seemed
okay.
a fascinating area. I also like that but it's a personal thing because of the measurement issues. There's some
Hmm.
maths in it that I like personally,
Okay.
but it's always hard to explain why someone gets interested in one particular area rather than another. I don't even
And
remember, to be honest. I already got dragged into this thing, to this individual differences thing as a master's student. So um,
and
I'm not sure I remember. I just seemed fascinating.
can you tell everyone a bit about your research? The one that I've been reading was the process overlap theory and what that is about and how you look at intelligence. I think it's one of the newest theories of intelligence out there.
Yes, it's quite new. It was
Hmm.
published in 2016, with a co-author, Andy Conway, who's a well-known working memory researcher, and we have been collaborating for a while. Um, And yes, processual theory is a theory of the positive manifold. But positive manifold is a phenomenon that refers to the finding. I mean, positive manifold refers to the finding that all cognitive tests correlate positively.
Hmm.
So if somebody does a vocabulary test, a test of mental rotation, general knowledge, fluid reasoning, speediness, critical
Abstract.
speed,
Yeah.
all of these things, then test results will correlate positively. Someone who's above average on one of these tests is very likely to be above average on all the rest, statistically speaking.
Hmm.
Which in many ways could be interpreted as a counterintuitive finding. I mean, if it were an armchair speculation competition, you could easily come up with arguments why this should be otherwise. Like if someone devotes a lot of energy and resources during development to develop one skill that has to cost others and so on, so one could come up with very nice arguments why there should be a negative
Hmm.
relationship between these abilities, but the fact of the matter is the opposite. So they all correlate positively. That's the positive manifold. Um, and if you apply a statistical technique called factor analysis, which I won't explain now for the sake of your audience, but if you do that, then you get something called a general factor,
Hmm.
which explains about half of the common variance between these tests. Um, and it's a statistical construction, but a construct. But it's a statistical equivalent of the positive manifold. So in most of intelligence research, there's been a lot of fuss about this general factor, also called G, very often. Um, but importantly, this is just a statistical representation of the positive manifold. It's just another way to say that everything correlates with everything else positively. And ultimately, what we're trying to explain is this pattern of all positive correlations rather than general factor per se. There is a difference because most research on general effect on G basically presume that this is something real, and it has there has to be a psychological equivalent of G. And there have been various explanations proposed. Um, some of them said that basically G is a general mental ability. So domain general cognitive ability or general intelligence that people use to solve all kinds of tests. Basically, this approach says that mental rotation and vocabulary correlate positively because despite the superficially different content, both tests measure the same general ability after all. There are other explanations. There's a mental speed explanation which said that basically G represents some kind of like the general speediness, general efficiency of the brain or something like that.
Hmm.
And people with more efficient brains will be better in everything. So this is conceptualized to some extent as like the frequency of a processor in a computer or something like that that makes every process faster. And actually, ours is not even the most recent explanation. There's a more recent explanation. I think it came out 2 years ago or maybe last year. I'm not even sure, which tries to explain G with mitochondrial efficiency. So it
Hmm.
actually breaks it all down to the
To the
cell level.
biological.
Yeah,
Hmm.
to the level of cells. Um, what we're trying to do in this theory is instead of explaining the general factor, we take a step back and we say there is not, we can explain this positive manifold without presuming a single causal mechanism of any kind interpreting and affecting all mental ability tests. And instead, basically what processability theory says is that the every test taps on a very large number of different things. You can call them
Hmm.
processes if you like, and there will be some overlap. There are some generalist processes, and these generalist processes are involved in a lot of different cognitive activity.
Psychometrics. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
and because of this overlap, the positive manifold will emerge. But it's not because there's a single thing affecting performance on all kinds of tests. It's because of something completely different.
Way more
Um,
complex. Yes.
Now, okay, so this sounds very abstract, and actually, just quite recently, we got involved in what this results in terms of applications.
Hmm.
And actually, it even surprised me, or I surprised myself. I don't know, but in the last year or so, just quite late actually, right, sometime after publishing the theory itself, I realized that there's more applied uses or references of this or consequences of this than I thought. Generally speaking, if you look at cognitive ability tests, you can find like group tests that can be administered without the personal interaction. So you can have a group of people that administer the same test to everyone. And there are individual administered tests where there are a lot of different 10, 12, 14 subtests, like the Wechsler scales is an example of an individual test, or a Woodcock-Johnson. Whereas, for instance, the Ravens matrices are an example of a group test. And if you do an individual administered test with a lot of subtests, then these test results will correlate. That's the positive manifold. Now, you can calculate an IQ score, an overall IQ score. For instance, in the Wechsler scales, it's called a full-scale IQ, which will technically be a weighted average of the subtest results. It's weighed because they are normalized first and so on. But it's technically there are methods to calculate that. That's the technical part. And there's the substantive part, how to interpret it. And basically, there are two competing approaches to this. One is a G-oriented approach, which basically is based on G theory, which says that all these tests, after all, measure the same thing. Some to different extents. They measure G plus something unique, plus something that could be called a specific ability, like verbal, spatial, and so on. But apart from these, they all measure G. And so this full-scale IQ, and the more tests you use and the more diverse tests you use, a better estimate of G you can obtain. And so basically the purpose of these measurement vehicles, these subtests, is to get an estimate of G, and IQ in this interpretation serves as a proxy for G. So basically this is some kind of top-down approach. So all these tests measure the same general ability, which can be nicely conceptualized as an IQ score. Even if it's technically obtained as a weighted average, it represents something real, a real general ability. Whereas the other approach focuses more like on subtests and actually interprets IQ the same way as it's calculated, just the weighted average. So it says that all these tests measure, in fact, different things, and you can get a weighted average. Like you can get there. In this respect, in this approach, IQ is a kind of an index, and so is G. And you can. There are a lot of indices used in the world like this. Like, for instance, global competitiveness index, or gender equality index, or our university rankings. Yeah, that's an example of one of my colleagues called Doug Detterman. I think it's a very nice example. If you compare universities, there are a number of different ranking systems for universities, which give somewhat different results, but there's also a strong correlation between them. So the exact ranking might be different, but you can bet a lot of money that Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard will be in the top 10 in all different ranking systems. And in this respect, it's quite similar to cognitive ability tests. They can give different results, but if you rank order people on a number of different tests, there will be a very high correlation between the rankings. And that's basically a restating of the positive manifold, if you think about it. But still, these university indices are weighted averages. Obviously, I mean, no one would think that they represent a single cause. It's the opposite. There are a lot of things measured, like number of publications, number of people, of lecturers with scientific degrees, the ratio of students per professors. I'm not even sure, but there are a number of different things that are measured. And these are weighed with different weights under different systems. That's why they sometimes provide somewhat different results. But in the end, they get an index of the value of the university. And if processorial theory is correct, and there's another theory called mutualism, actually, which is a different theory, but interprets G the same way. If these approaches are correct, then IQ is a weighted average and not of different things rather than
Different.
representation of a single thing that manifests itself in different ways. And that has enormous importance in application. Not just, I mean, if you focus on IQ, you basically rank order under IQ. So you get a
Mm-hmm.
single dimensional rank order, and the other approach emphasizes specific abilities more. But if your goal is not only measurement, but like let's say you want to develop something, then it's very different if you think something is real or if something's an index. So, for instance, I use the example of global competitiveness index. If a government wants to improve a country's economy, they will not try to improve the global competitiveness index. That
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't make sense to improve an index. They will try to develop or improve the things that constitute this index, like flexibility of the market, availability of resources,
Mm-hmm.
quality of education, and all those things
All those things, yes, all
that
those
actually
specific
result in the,
things. Yep.
yes, exactly. So yes, sorry if I'm too long in
Mhm. No, no,
answering,
no, 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 no.
but
I'm
yes,
trying to keep up with you and
okay. So yes, it has implications for education and development and a number of different things that to be frank with you, I only realized quite recently in the last 2 years or so. Before that, I was just living in the ivory tower of pure basic
pure
research, trying to
theory.
explain the positive manifest. A very abstract phenomenon. It's an interesting phenomenon, and it's one of the most replicated findings in psychology. We these days we often emphasize that because there's this replication crisis in
Hmm.
psychology, and the positive manifold is probably, many people argue, the single most replicated finding in all of psychology, uh, because ability testing takes place in a lot of different educational, occupational, and military contexts, and there's literally it's been replicated on hundreds of large-scale data sets.
And it has about hundreds of years, right? It's more than 100 years of
Yes,
research
it was
on
first
this.
discovered. It was first discovered in the early 20th century, so it's more than
Hmm.
100 years old, which also makes it interesting. Like it's well established, replicated, and still there is no consensus about its nature. And the approach we took was that maybe we couldn't. Maybe the reason there's no consensus, and maybe the reason we couldn't understand why G as a causal mechanism is that it's not a causal mechanism at all.
Hmm. And that's where the process overlap theory comes
Yes,
from.
yes.
Now, Christoph, I do want to back up a bit because, as I told you, I did a bit of research and I looked on LinkedIn, on Reddit, and a few other websites to understand how I work in HR, right? Talent acquisition mostly. And I was trying to understand how my fellow HR talent acquisitions candidates view IQ, G, general cognitive ability, right? It has different names online. And let me take you a bit through what I found because it's quite interesting. So I'm going first through LinkedIn. First, if you do a research with intelligence, it only talks about business system intelligence, nothing else. It has nothing to do with the human ability, right? Then if you do a search with cognitive abilities, I think the most viewed post, which had about 86,000 people who viewed it and about 3,000 who liked it, was that cognitive abilities depend, I'm quoting, on four habits: exercise, healthy eating, relaxation, and sleep, right? This gets the most hits. Then there's two posts on USA Politics, which have a lot of hits. Only three of them actually go on neuroscience, and they have maybe as likes about 200 in total, three, right? And then there's one which is shouting that cognitive abilities are declining, the world is doomed, like literally. There are about three discussing about racial issues, that the black are discriminated, even though they have the same cognitive level. And I don't want to discuss this, right? There's two of them talking about marijuana and how marijuana influences cognitive abilities.
Um,
Uh, so if you go on general cognitive abilities, you have Jordan Peterson, who appears first. So that's nice, talking about, he's a psychologist. He's talking about general cognitive abilities, which is really nice. But the rest go on the same kind of marijuana, racism, yeah, just presumptions on what they are. If you go on Reddit, so this was LinkedIn. If you go on Reddit, there's a ton of candidates worried that they will be tested, their general cognitive abilities will be tested, and have no idea what they should do, what they should learn, how they should prepare, what is that all about. Now with Reddit, there's actually, I will have a question at some point, because giving feedback to candidates who actually take this test is quite important. And we do have an issue to explain them what we saw in the psychometric results. And most of the time they don't get any answer. But I feel that they don't get any answer because we as HR people and professionals, we don't know to explain what's the difference between G, IQ, general cognitive ability, mental abilities. So I would kindly ask you to bring a bit of clarification and to let everyone know what's the difference. What is there? Is G the same with IQ? Are general mental abilities the same with general cognitive abilities? How should we look at all of this terminology?
Well, yeah, as I just explained, I have a subjective view there because we're sort of challenging the mainstream in a sense with post-social theories. It depends who you ask. If Jordan
Just,
Peterson were sitting in this
uh-huh,
chair, he would, well, he's not an intelligence researcher, but he's very knowledgeable about the field. So he's read a lot. I've
true.
heard
He's
him.
more personality, yeah. And
Yeah,
yeah.
I've heard him talk about this. But he basically he follows the mainstream interpretation of G, uh, which is that it represents some kind of general cognitive ability, even
Mhm.
though we don't really understand. We haven't understood for 100 years what it really is. But regardless, it's some kind of general cognitive ability.
Make it, maybe the
And
request
so
would be to make it easy for someone who's not in the doing research to understand and use it practically.
Yeah, as I said, there are these two different approaches, pretty much.
Mhm.
So Jordan Peterson, or people Jordan Peterson, whose research Jordan Peterson is citing, would say that G represents general cognitive ability, and IQ is a proxy for G.
Mhm. And when you
So
say proxy for G, it's another way of calculating. So there's another way of calculating IQ deriving from G, from that positive correlation of psychometrics, right? The
yes, but
positive one.
if you individually, so G is manifests itself in databases. You have to do
Hmm.
factor analysis, which is a statistical technique for which you need variance. If you do individual testing, like in HR, you won't get G.
Hmm.
You will get an IQ, which I said is a weight sum score of subtests, or you can try to estimate G with a just fewer subtests, but let's put that aside
Hmm.
because it's a different thing. Um, So yes, basically, what you do individual assessment, you won't get G, you will get an IQ score.
Hmm.
And if you're a subscriber of the G approach, then you interpret this IQ as a proxy for G. And if G represents general ability, general cognitive ability, and IQ, that IQ score basically is a representation of a general cognitive ability. Uh, Under processual theories approach and mutualism and few theories that contradict this G-centric view, they would say that IQ is a sum score of a number of specific independent abilities like spatial, verbal, and so on. And G is also like an index. If you
Hmm.
just do different, G, as I said, manifests itself in population. IQ can manifest itself on a single individual. But these are indices according to this second approach. Now,
Hmm.
the last word hasn't been said, so and as I said, we're sort of challenging the mainstream. So I would put my money on the second, that IQ and G are indices.
Hmm.
Um, but basically, these are the two approaches. Of course, there are measurement issues as well. So in the 1950s, 60s, especially in clinical psychology, there was a movement which put extreme emphasis on subtest
Hmm.
and score analysis. So basically, just to put this theoretical thing, like what's IQ, what's G, are they indices or representations of a single thing? Um, Apart from these, there's this practical measurement issue. What should we focus on the single individual? If you focus on an IQ score that as the main target of test score interpretation, then we get a global measure.
Hmm.
Other people say, there's a school, I would say, focuses on profile-based assessment. That instead of just having a global measure, it's much more useful to have sub-scale scores which reveal individual strengths and weaknesses. Someone can be very talented in one field, like verbal abilities, and very not
Mhm.
talented in other fields, like spatial, or vice versa, and so on. And then, as I said, in the 1950s and 60s, especially in clinical psychology, there was a movement which took this profile-based thing to the extreme. They said that a clinician can get important information not only on the subtest level, but even at the level of individual items. Um, and this basically was abandoned because it was widely criticized for measurement issues.
Mhm.
The lower level you get on a test, the less reliable basically the measure. So a global IQ score is much more reliable as a psychometric construct than a subtest score, and this is indeed true. Um, so basically, process overlap theory uh, suggests focusing on specific factors and specific abilities which are aggregates of tasks, not individual subtests, but sort of
Mhm.
aggregates of that, like spatial ability, verbal ability, speediness, working memory, and so on,
So when we
rather
talk
than, yeah,
about
sorry.
mental abilities, it's basically subsets, right? All the specific abilities that you're just referring right now, different to G or general cognitive ability or IQ. Those would be more related to each other, even though differently seen. And mental abilities would be subsets.
They correlate. So if you
Hmm.
measure, you can't get rid of the positive manifold. It's a very massive phenomenon. So
Yeah.
no, no. What I mean by this is that if you correlate subtests, you will get the
Hmm.
positive manifold right there,
Okay.
and you can get G. If
Hmm.
you use other factor analytic techniques, again, I won't go into details. Then you can get the special abilities first, like a spatial ability.
Hmm.
You could call something similarly to G. It's a statistical construct,
Okay.
but it's, let's say you say there's a spatial ability that accounts for correlations for tests with a spatial content, or
Hmm.
you get a verbal factor, or it's more often called crystallized intelligence or crystallized ability that accounts for correlation between tests like vocabulary tests, general knowledge,
Hmm.
verbal comprehension, and so on.
Okay. Is
But you
there?
can't get rid of the positive manifold,
You cannot.
which
Yes.
means that if you do this, then these abilities will be correlated. So you see
Yes.
my point. So either you get an IQ score from all the subtests, you get a G from all the subtests,
Hmm.
right? Or and then you get some residuals, which means that space tests with the spatial content, even though everything correlates with everything else positively, tests with the spatial content correlate with one another a little more strongly than tests with verbal content. But if
Yes.
you can get a G first, and then you get residuals representing statistically this phenomenon, or you can get special abilities and then they will correlate. So you can calculate, instead of looking at subtest
Hmm.
scores, you calculate someone's spatial ability, someone's verbal ability, and so on. You still find that these will correlate.
Hmm.
Someone with a higher spatial ability will have a higher verbal ability. And then again, you can get a sort of what's called a higher order G
Yeah.
statistically that explains this correlation. Or you can just leave them correlated and say this correlation is caused by something else. And this is what process overlap theory says.
Perfect. In our world, I've asked a few of my colleagues, and we mostly use Raven, Wechslers, and definitely test for the different mental abilities. Right? Usually, it's verbal, logical, abstract, and yeah, one of the others. So, is there one psychometric which is better than another, or how should we look at them? Should we look at Ravens and Wechslers, which more give an idea of IQ, or should we look at the separate mental abilities? What would represent or what would bring more value in a process of selection or promoting someone? If it makes sense, my question, right?
Yes, it,
Because
it does.
yeah,
Well, these are pretty much, I think, two questions. One
yes,
is which test to use. Well, there are tests that have different approaches. as I said, the Wechsler scales, they are mostly G-based,
Mm-hmm.
which means that they will focus on the most important thing you can obtain from a Wechsler scale is the full scale IQ.
Yeah.
Now, the original and Wechsler, the original constructor of the test, really subscribed to the view that you need to measure G with a lot of different things, and you need to put together a lot of different things. But that's the reason for the diverse content of Wechsler scales is not to measure these diverse things,
Mm-hmm.
but to measure G the best way
G.
you can.
Mm-hmm.
And so its most important indicator is the full scale IQ. If you look at the Woodcock-Johnson scales of cognitive abilities, for instance, then you will find that it measures 7 different factors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to be fair, the Wechsler scales in the original form, they had a full scale IQ, and they had just 2 scales, a verbal scale and a performance scale. And in the last few editions of the Wechsler scales, it's become more elaborate. So they have 4 factors:
Mm-hmm.
working memory, speediness, perceptual reasoning, and verbal. Um, so you can get a profile kind of score on 4 abilities, but it's more like an afterthought, to be honest, in the construction of the Wechsler scales. The Woodcock-Johnson scales, for instance, are built on a model called CHC, which is the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model of cognitive abilities. I see you've heard about this before,
Mm-hmm.
and it measures 7 different factors. So it's more compatible with a profile-based approach, the Woodcock-Johnson, more compatible than the Wechsler. Also, if you just look carefully, you'll find that like Nomen is Omen, really, because the Wechsler scales are called for the WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children.
Mm-hmm.
The adult version is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So it's scale, it's singular, and it has the
Yeah.
word intelligence in it. The Woodcock-Johnson test is called the Woodcock-Johnson Tests of Cognitive Abilities. So it doesn't say intelligence, and it
Mm-hmm.
uses abilities in plural. And that actually, that's a very nice instance where the name of the test actually gives a hint on the approach it takes. So if you like a more profile-based thing that measures the number of different cognitive abilities, then you could probably go for that. If your
Mm-hmm.
purpose is to get a general scale of intelligence in singular, then use the Wechsler. The
It's the
Wechsler,
same with ravens, I imagine.
yeah, well, no, it is a little different. So the
Okay.
Wechsler is much more widely used than the
Okay.
Woodcock Johnson, to be honest. But again, I keep declaring subjectivity and conflict of interest here. So from the approach that follows from process of overlap
Mm-hmm.
theory, the Woodcock Johnson is more appropriate as a
Mm-hmm.
test because it focuses on specific abilities and provides a profile-based
Mm-hmm.
score of individual strengths and weaknesses. The Ravens. The Ravens is it doesn't measure a number of different abilities. It measures a single thing. It measures what's called fluid intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fluid intelligence is the ability to solve problems when somebody cannot rely on already acquired skills or knowledge. So basically, somebody has to reason on the spot and cannot
Mm-hmm.
rely on previous experience. And this is contrasted with in the CHC theory, for instance, CHC model, which originates from the fluid crystallized model in many ways. So this is contrasted with crystallized intelligence. So fluid and crystallized, those are the two
Yeah.
things. Crystallized is the knowledge, is basically the application of already acquired skills and knowledge. And the Ravens has a pair, sort of, the Mill Hill vocabulary scales, because
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary is a very good measure of crystallized intelligence. It's very
Crystallization.
vocabulary is very central. If you measure someone's vocabulary, with that you can predict verbal skills and general
Mm-hmm.
knowledge to a very large extent. It's a very good central measure of crystallized knowledge and crystallized abilities. So to complement the progressive matrices, there's the Mill Hill
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary scales. And so the Ravens measures just fluid reasoning. Um, and fluid reasoning is often measured with things like the Ravens, most often like
Mm-hmm.
nonverbal it's apparently always measured with non-verbal extract reasoning, like matrix reasoning, like in the progressive matrices. But not only that, usually it's measured with any kind of inductive reasoning. So just like vocabulary is very central for crystallized knowledge, inductive reasoning seems to be very central to fluid
To fluid.
intelligence.
Mhm.
And interestingly, one of the things that correlates very, very nicely with the ravens, and is also a good measure of fluid intelligence, is number series,
Mhm.
which is very different. And number series, when you get a list of numbers and you have
Yeah,
to find
two,
the next
four,
one.
eight. Find the next one. Yeah.
Superficially, it's very different from a matrix test. I mean, that's non-verbal. It seems like it has a spatial content, and the other involves numbers and basic arithmetics and so on. But what's common in both the Ravens and number series is inductive reasoning. You have to find a pattern.
Mhm.
You have to recognize a pattern. And then you have to apply it. So, like in the Ravens, you have a 3 times 3 matrix with the ninth element missing, and you have 8 options from which to select the missing element. And so you have to find a pattern, a logical pattern by which the 8 pieces are arranged together, and then applying that logic to select the ninth one. And with number series, even though it's superficially very similar, very different, sorry,
Very different.
uh,
Yeah.
it's still
It's
you do something very similar. You look at the existing series, you have to find a pattern, and then you have to find one of the options that actually continues that pattern,
and you
which
have to
actually
work
brings
with the
us to
numbers in mind and keep them in your working memory and juggle with
yes,
them and
yes,
test
yes,
different
yes.
options.
And for all kind of inductive reasoning,
Mhm.
it's very important what you just said. For all kinds of inductive reasoning, you use a lot of working memory and also things that's interesting because it brings us to the issue of what tests really measure. So all inductive tests correlate very nicely with very strongly with working memory. But
Mhm.
it's not just because you store things in your head. It's also because working memory itself depends to a very large extent on what we call cognitive inhibition. So you have to discard from your
Mhm.
mind things you don't need anymore. If you can't, then you sort of
You get stuck. It's too
yeah,
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
Your
Go over
mental
and over again.
space, so to speak, is
Yeah.
decreased and gets over and so on.
Yeah.
And if you do inductive reasoning, there's a lot of inhibition that needs to be used,
Mhm.
unless you just look at the pattern and you look at the item and immediately find out the pattern and apply it, which you do for the easier items, but you can't do all along. I mean, after a while, you will encounter an item that's hard enough, so the first gut reaction will be incorrect,
Mhm.
and you have to then be because for instance, in a matrix item, you look at the upmost row, the first, the top row, and you see, oh, I see what's going on. And then you look at the row below, and then you realize it
The
doesn't work
rules have
anymore.
changed. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what do you do? If you've ever taken the ravens, it's really, I mean, you can just keep looking at it instead of try to force the item not to look like that. I mean, you want that
Mhm.
second row not to look like that. You want it to look a way that complements with the first, and actually, your logic is fine. But you have to let that idea go. You have to inhibit that rule. You have to discard it, and then you have to figure out something else. And there's also a reason, even though neither test measure inhibition directly, like it's
Mhm.
measured in a cognitive psychologist laboratory with different cognitive tasks, still inhibition is involved. And if you look at number series itself, that's a very tricky thing because in many tests there's a number series task that belongs to the numerical category. So,
Mhm.
for instance, there's a German test called the ISTR that has a verbal fluid and the numerical component, and number series comes as a numerical component, whereas in the Woodcock-Johnson number series comes as a fluid component because you see just it's not if you look at the test it's not necessarily obvious what it measures. You look at it, you say, oh, it's got numbers, it's you have to
It's the
use
same.
arithmetic,
Yeah.
so it's numbers. But it might turn out that it correlates very nicely with it correlates more strongly with the ravens than with numerical tests that actually
Mhm.
measure arithmetics. So a test doesn't necessarily measure what it seems to
It
measure
seems
at
to
the
measure.
first look because um, I have an example when I have to teach this. I always use the same example. There are in the matrix kind of items. There are colored ones. In the ravens as well, there's a called colored progressive matrices. But now these days there are many clones, so to speak, of the ravens, and some of them are computerized and take advantage of computer screens, so that having colored items is not a costly thing. Um, and sometimes colors in these items are used as part of the logic. So for instance, you have to figure, okay, there are 3 green items, there are 3 blue items, but only 2 red items, so the missing item has to be red.
Has to be read, yeah.
Does this item measure color discrimination? Probably not really. I mean, if even though it's color, and you have to see colors,
It's just induction
if
logic.
yeah, it measures inductions, but importantly, if you cannot discriminate colors at all, so if you're completely colorblind and you can't use contrast or any other short loop then you cannot solve the item, because you can't see colors, you won't find the logic. So in a way, this test involves color discrimination, to discriminate colors. If you don't have that ability, you will not be able to solve the item. But it does not measure color discrimination, in the sense that individual differences in the outcome, in the final score of the test, will not correlate with individual differences in color discrimination. You can find tests of color discrimination where there are very, very subtle differences in colors, and you have to recognize those, and it measures your sensitivity to actually discriminate different shades of colors. So there's such a thing as color discrimination, and there are individual differences in that. But a colored matrix item will not measure that. So it requires color discrimination, but doesn't measure it, which sounds silly, but that is the case.
So bottom line, if someone applies it, needs to make sure that the person sitting in front of them can discriminate colors, and then they can take the test in a normal environment like everyone else.
So it's a requirement.
Yes.
But it's not. When we say a test measures something, what we mean is that individual differences in the outcome of the test reflect that something being measured, individual differences in that something. And just like in a colored matrix item, it doesn't measure color discrimination. It's a prerequisite to solve the item. But it doesn't measure that, because individual differences in the test score will not reflect individual differences in discrimination. It will reflect individual differences in inductive reasoning. And if you look at number series, it's very similar. You need to be able to use mental arithmetics, very simple ones. So it's in number series, it's never complex arithmetics. It's the important thing is to recognize the pattern. But the arithmetics itself is simple, basic elementary additions, subtractions, sometimes multiplications, and that's pretty much it. So even though it requires arithmetics, it's not a test of arithmetics. This test would do a very bad job if you wanted to measure to predict specific arithmetic skills from that. It measures inductive reasoning, and it correlates more with the ravens than with pure tests of mathematics.
And with fluid intelligence.
Yes, so they both measure fluid intelligence after all, because they measure inductive reasoning. And just to complete that thought, so I said vocabulary is central to crystallized intelligence. Matrix items are inductive reasoning in general is central to fluid, but fluid in itself is very central to intelligence itself, the structure of intelligence. It's very important. That's why tests like the ravens are enormously useful, for instance, in HR settings. It's because so again, back to the positive manifold, always back. Everything correlates with everything else positively. Means that if someone's above average on one test, no matter what the test is, you put your money on the person being above average on any random other test. You put your money better than if you put your money against it. So these tests predict one another, sort of. So if someone has an above average spatial ability, you can predict that they will have an above average verbal ability. But this prediction is not very accurate. There will be a lot of error. So if you want to predict someone's mental rotation from their vocabulary, the prediction will be inaccurate. You can to some extent, because they correlate positively, but this will not be very accurate.
But the correlation is smaller.
Yes. Uh, if you if you use fluid intelligence for prediction, that's the best you can do, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
So fluid intelligence predicts someone's spatial ability and verbal ability better than spatial and verbal predict one another. So
Mm-hmm.
if you want to have something that seems very central statistically speaking, uh, st- uh, statistically speaking, you would say that fluid reasoning tests have the highest G loading of all tests,
Mm-hmm.
which means that they correlate most strongly to what's common in all tests than
Mm-hmm.
any other kind of test. So if you want to use a single test, then it's a very good decision to use to
To
fluid.
use
And
ravens.
as for selection,
Yeah.
reply to the second question, it always depends on your purpose. I mean, if you want to predict ability or in a job that requires verbal reasoning to a very large
Mm-hmm.
extent because for some reason the job requires verbal, then
Yeah,
you
customer
will need to,
service or jobs where you need to
yeah,
interact with
then you
people.
won't use a spatial ability
Mm-hmm.
test, you will use a verbal ability test. If you fluid intelligence is great as a predictor, but if there's a job which is built on routine, so the
Mm-hmm.
person will not encounter situations practically ever that would
That are
require
novel.
reasoning
Yeah.
on the spot, then it's not very useful. But to be frank, most jobs these days, and especially people talk about jobs of the future, and this is probably what your podcast is about. Fluid intelligence will be probably be that would be my prediction will become even more and more important. Simply because there are these predictions. You've probably read
Mm-hmm.
a whole lot more on this than I have. So there are these predictions that 30, 40 years from now, like half of the jobs will be such that they don't even exist these days, or
Yeah.
20%, 40%. I don't even know the actual estimates. But if that is the case, then highlights the importance of fluid ability
Fluid
because
intelligence.
people will need to reason on the spot. They will encounter workplace situations when they cannot necessarily apply or the acquire skills or knowledge.
Christoph, continuing on this idea, so if we talk about fluid or even crystallized intelligence, what do they predict? Do they predict performance? Do they predict learning ability or agility? How others call it? That's a debate in the with researchers as well as a name and yeah. What what do they predict? Because if you read Schmidt, and I think that's at least the only meta-analysis that I found, which was redone 85 years, it was 1998 and 2016, I think he did the last one after 100 years of research. He said that general cognitive abilities are the best predictor of performance, right, on the job performance. Now, he describes general mental abilities like the subsets, right? So mathematical reasoning, verbal, logical, abstract, and all of the others. But he talks about IQ as well. So there's a bit of yeah. So what do they predict? Some talk about learning agility, some talk about being more able to deal with change. So how should we look at this?
Well, I think the Smith and Hunter results are very robust and very
Mm-hmm.
convincing. General mental ability, general cognitive ability, how they call it, is a very good predictor of a lot of things. It's a very good predictor of workplace achievement, like job efficiency. They already have very good predictors of level of education, number of years spent in education, and they are very good predictors of job performance indeed, especially in cognitively demanding jobs. Now, the only place where, of course, I wouldn't agree with Frenchman is probably that he interprets this as G representing a general mental ability.
Mm-hmm.
In our interpretation, general mental ability is an index, as I
Yeah.
explained thoroughly. But when it comes to prediction, there's really not much difference. So if you have an index variable like a university ranking index
Mm-hmm.
or gender equality index that can be enormously useful for prediction, regardless of that thing being a weight average and not representing a single causal effect. And that's the case with G, and in that respect, IQ is as you said, they are always or often substitutes for one another in these papers. So IQ as a proxy for G can be very, very useful for prediction. And it
Mm-hmm.
predicts a number of things in the workplace, a number of sociological things. It predicts income to some extent, not very strong. There's correlations not very strong, but
Mm-hmm.
robust, reliable. And they even predict things like health and longevity. So basically, people with higher IQ live longer,
Mm-hmm.
and they
Usually
live
that they
longer.
they should make better life decisions.
There are a number of different explanations for this, because if you control for a number of different things, the relationship still exists. One
Mm-hmm.
is that what you just mentioned, that they uh, there's a, that they exhibit more health conscious behaviors, for instance. Uh, Before, it was well known that smoking is bad for your health.
Mm-hmm.
There was no correlation between smoking and intelligence. uh, when it became well known that it's very bad for your health if you smoke. Now there's a negative correlation. Now more higher IQ people are less likely to smoke, but it's not because they don't want to smoke. It's because they're more health conscious. So
Mm-hmm.
that's probably one of the explanations. Another
Maybe the
explanation.
inhibition works better.
Sorry.
Maybe the inhibition works better with
Yeah,
them.
maybe inhibition works better
Yeah.
also. Yeah. Um, Also, they are more likely to end. If you have a hierarchy, you are more likely to end up for jobs that's not deteriorating for your health.
Mm-hmm.
um so like if you work, I mean, this what you see behind me is a less damaging work environment than a lot of others you could imagine.
Yep.
And some people say that the link is genetic,
Mm-hmm.
because basically hierarchy is a representation under that approach of brain health, and brain health in turn correlates with health generally.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of different explanations why that might be the case, and there's a lot of research going on, a lot of genetics research going on this, and these explanations are not mutually exclusive. So there might be like mutually uh, additive causes rather than exclusive.
Yeah. I'm quite curious when the genetic researches will be over. I imagine they will be highly controversial. I mean, right now, IQ and intelligence, I mean, it differs by sexes, it differs by races and everything. There's been a lot of study. I think Linda Gottfredson did a lot of the studies. And yeah, Murray. And then they are quite controversial. And again, this is not the topic, but I'm kind of curious what will happen when genetics comes into play.
Um,
Yes.
Bob Plomin, who was a well-known genetician and a very great genetician, Robert Plomin, he recently wrote a book called Blueprint,
Hmm.
where he argues for the genetic causes for a lot of things. And it's already very controversial. I mean, this whole nature nurture issue is one of the most
Yeah.
controversial ones in psychology. But now it's an expanding field, and not only for psychology. There's also a rapidly expanding field called educational genetics, educational
Hmm.
genomics, where they directly predict educational outcomes from genes.
From
So
genes.
what they do is they do a gene-wide search. It's called GWAS. This
Hmm.
approach is genome-wide association studies. So they scan someone's entire genome, and basically look for any place where uh, where a given variant
Hmm.
correlates with a phenotypic outcome like IQ,
Hmm.
and then use these genetic places to predict the outcome. I mean, these studies are correlational, and as
Yes.
we all learn very well, correlation doesn't
It's
imply
not
causation.
causation.
So there's a
Yeah.
lot of debate on this. Uh, Somebody used a very elegant example. If you create a system, you're the king of an imaginary country, and you create a system where university access is restricted based on hair color,
Hmm.
and you say that brown haired people are free to go to the university, black-haired people can go, but they have to obtain higher scores to get in than brown-haired people. But you say that red-haired people, only half of them are allowed to enter, and when it comes to blondes, they are really really restricted from. And in this country, you will find a strong genetic correlation
Mhm.
between some place in the genome and IQ, and that place in the genome will represent hair color, not cognitive abilities. So what needs to be kept in mind is, as long as we don't clearly understand the causal mechanisms, we cannot
Jump to
confidently say
conclusions.
that we have identified genes for intelligence. We
Mhm.
have identified genetic correlates of intelligence, which is not this. It's not nitpicking. It's not the same thing, and the same for education. Having said that, these gene-wide association studies I found amazing actually, and there's a lot of progress going on.
Mhm.
It often happens in science that some technological thing basically makes people so enthusiastic that there's a lot of research, and the theoretical interpretation sort of starts to follow slowly. It was very similar with neuroscience, actually. I mean, when psychologists first got their hands on these brain imaging machines, they were
True.
so fascinated that, oh, so when people do this in the scanner, then this lights up, and for the first time we could study brains at work.
It,
Well, people were still,
it was amazing.
yeah,
I
people were
remember I
still.
was a psychologist. I was in school when they were just coming up, and then they could use and they could see them in color, and it was just wow, this is what lights up. Mm.
I was like that as a student. I was like,
Yeah,
wow, and then this
exactly.
and that area of the brain is active, and we can see the person's there, the scanner. We were just talking to them 2 minutes ago, and now we see their brain on the screen, and this so it's absolutely fascinating. But there was a lot of over enthusiasm there as
Hmm.
well, and some more substantive theoretical interpretation was to follow, actually, because people were just overly enthusiastic, and these were just correlations. So neuroscience
Yeah.
is it doesn't mean that neuroscience is useless. On the contrary, it's absolutely amazing.
Hmm.
But the first wave of enthusiasm, just based on the technology, basically was something that was only followed by theory. And I think in many ways it's similar with genes these days. I mean, and I'm truly fascinated so that we can scan someone's entire genome. I mean, we have to stop there, and before we continue, that's already like amazing.
That's
But
already amazing.
yeah, we scan someone's entire genome, and then we do that for a number of people, and then we look for correlations, and we
Hmm.
find correlations. So that is brilliant. But among
Jumping
all
to
that
conclusions, it's
technological enthusiasm, we have to keep in mind, we have to keep reminding ourselves that these are correlations. But when we understand the causal mechanism, that there will be something again. But
I'm looking
then we
forward
will
to that.
actually. Sorry.
I'm looking forward to
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
I'm kind of curious. Now, talking about technology, and this was a question that I wanted to ask, and I read in your research and some of the related research as well. IQ seems to be growing, right? Generation by generation, the level of IQ seems to be growing. Uh, how should we look at that? Because I'm not sure, because the kind of tests that we use, they never tell us whether we use norms, but we don't know when they have been updated, in what kind of languages, what countries. I don't imagine they're redone every generation. So how should we look at that? How should we interpret that? Where I left it was, I think 100 was the average score, 85 was the minimum. This was Ravens to get into the US Army. How should I look at that now if I have a Ravens in front of me?
Okay. So for first, it's a phenomenon called the Flynn effect
Hmm.
by someone called James Flynn, who first discovered it. And it was actually, you mentioned Murray. It was Murray who named it Flynn effect, which is interesting because Jim Flynn is a devoted environmentalist. So he is one who has been the fiercest opponent of the hereditarian
Hmm.
community, sort of, in the last few decades. And basically, he's interested in this IQ gains because he uses them as a demonstration that something environmental must place,
Mm-hmm.
because these IQ changes are large scale and no corresponding genetic change has taken place. As for the okay, so that's one thing. Second, it's not ever continuing. Unfortunately, it seems to have stopped. So
Okay.
most recent data shows that it probably has stopped in many industrialized countries that we have data on, but it did go on for 100 years or so. Now, as for the actual numbers, 185, how does that go? I try not to be technical, but in
Mm-hmm.
order to understand this and how to use this actually in applications, because it's not only HR, this affects the death penalty. There are books on this
Okay.
because
Okay.
for someone to, anyway, so I get there.
Yes.
Um, the way IQ tests are normed is that you administer a test with a large population, and then the mean score will be worth 100 IQ. So that's the concept called deviation IQ. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
invented by Wexler. Um, so you compare someone's result, someone's raw score on a test, with the raw score distribution of a population, and that's called the norming
Mm-hmm.
population, the sample to which everyone is compared. Now, if somebody gets a score that's the population mean, so somebody performs at the same level of people on average, will get an IQ of 100. This is usually age standardized, so people are compared to their peers rather than people of different age groups. And
Mm-hmm.
if you perform at the same level as the average of your peers, your IQ will be 100. And then every standard deviation is worth 15 IQ points.
Okay.
So if you perform one standard deviation above the mean, it will be 115, two standard deviation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since this follows a normal distribution, or to be more precise, we presume it does, or we massage our test results until they do
Oh,
for normal distribution, because the normal distribution has very nice properties.
mm-hmm.
We can convert these to percentiles, which means that we know how rare that performance is. If
Mm-hmm.
someone performs on average, they will get an IQ of 100 and also a percentile of 50,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the mean and the normal
Also,
distribution is symmetrical, so
exactly.
exactly as many people are below the mean as above the mean. Statistically speaking, you would say that the mean equals the median, because there
Mm-hmm.
is an equal number of people above and below the mean. Um, so that's for the mean. If you perform one standard deviation, you know that you've performed better than 80 for about 84% of people.
Mm-hmm.
If you perform two standard deviations, then you will say you performed at the 98th percentile. So you
90%. Mm-hmm.
outperform 98 out of 100 people, and so on. And that's the way to standardize a test.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so then you get an IQ score which can be converted to percentile scores. It's just a side note. Personally, I prefer percentiles a lot. IQ is something that's
Yeah.
very, very often misunderstood, and and then it's all over the tabloid media. I'm not gonna say names, but there's no month that passes without one or two famous actors finding out that they have an IQ of 195, or somebody finding a 2-year-old who's already
True.
smarter than Einstein. I love those. I love those headlines. It's only 22-month-old and already smarter than Einstein. I mean, but what can they probably even mean by smart in that context? Anyway,
Yes.
so I think percentiles are much better, and in my practice, I also find it's much easier. People are fascinated by IQ scores, but they cannot really interpret that. I mean, it's hard. How is 140 a lot? Is 160 a lot? I mean, whereas if you say that, okay, your IQ is higher than 97 out
The
of 100
97%.
people, that's
Yes.
everybody understands, somebody understands. So that's percentiles IQs, they're always convertible in normal distribution.
I
You
think
get,
that works well with the index as well, right? With the indices, because
yeah,
it gives you pretty much a ranking.
yeah.
In a
But
100, you
it's
are
it's
the
it's it's
97th.
compatible with to be frank,
Mhm.
I'm pro index, as you know, but it's compatible with the G approach as well. I mean, you
Mhm.
can, if
Yeah.
you can index people. I mean, if you measure someone's height, you don't need to have a deviation kind of score, because that has an absolute. That's very different from IQ actually, because that's an absolute score, someone's height, and the reason that's an absolute score is you have an absolute zero. With IQ, you don't have that, an absolute zero, and so you can only use this as a relative index rather than an absolute one. But if you could represent height and a normal distribution and convert it to percentiles, even though it's a very real thing, it's not an index, someone's height is still, you can say, if you're taller than 97 out of 100 people, then your percentile score for height is 97. Even though you can also express it in centimeters. Okay, so that's compatible with both. So that's how you norm tests. You give them to a large sample of people, and they calculate the mean and the standard deviation in order to translate them to percentiles and or IQ scores. Now, if you keep repeating that, you might find that these means have shifted. And that's the Flynn effect. So it means that the mean score of a population has shifted from, let's say, 42 out of 60 to 44 out of 60. Which means that in this new standardization, you will need to have a 44 out of 60 to have an IQ of 100.
100, exactly.
And that's so you don't have to. Every new norm is a new norm, and the mean will always be 100. It's not. It won't change. But if you want to express the magnitude of the change, or the magnitude of the Flynn effect, as they say, what you can do is you can compare the new mean to the old norm.
Yes.
So if you
and then you will see the increase in population.
Exactly. So you get, now the mean is 44, and the previous standardization was 42. You look at the old norms, how many people you would have outperformed with that score 44 in the previous standardization, and you translate that to an IQ, and you find that with 44 you would have had an IQ of 106 in the old norm, and then you can say the extent of the change is 6 IQ points over the period of time that actually elapsed between the two personalizations. So if it was, let's say, 12 years, then you say it's 6 IQ points over 12 years, which means half an IQ point for every year. Basically, that's what you do. And there are two side notes, and then I'll stop. One is that this effect is much stronger on fluid than on crystallized tests.
Okay.
So the increase is much stronger on fluid than crystallized. That's it's strongest on fluid and weakest on crystallized.
Okay.
It's one thing, but on average, if you aggregate all, it's about 0.3. And that's the recommendation. Actually, there's a book I read, interesting. Death penalty is not an area of my expertise, but there's a book on intellectual assessment regarding the death penalty, which is a fascinating topic. I'm European, so we don't even have death penalty, but as you know, in the US and in many states there's death penalty, but you cannot you cannot use death penalty on someone below a given level of IQ. So IQ there can be a matter of life and death. And using outdated, obsolete norms can be a misconduct resulting in the death penalty wrongfully applied. Jim Flynn has actually served as expert witness at US courts regarding the death penalty, trying to convince the court that the norms were obsolete and the guy's IQ is actually below 70. And the only reason it's above 70 is it didn't take into account the Flynn effect. And in that particular book, I read a recommendation that a 0.3 compensation should be applied for every year the norm is outdated. So if the norm was 8 years old, then 2.4 IQ points have to be subtracted. So that's the way to, and that's called Flynn correction. The best way to deal with the Flynn effect is to renorm the test as often as you can, but at least every 10 years. If you cannot do that for some reason, at least then you should apply this Flynn correction.
But then we stop applying this correction, right? Because it's not.
Yeah, if it's not, I haven't seen that followed up in books on death penalty, but eventually, yes, we will probably have to. I mean, if it has stopped, then yes, you're right.
But it's interesting because I would have thought, I didn't read it anywhere, but I would have thought that with all the technology and everything, it would continue to grow.
Yes, again, this is something that I've read.
But it's, yeah.
Yeah, I've read all kinds of speculations on this, pro and con. I've read speculations that, oh, with all this like you just said, with all this
Hmm.
technology, we'll have to have higher and higher queues to deal with all the technology. And there are also the technological pessimists. I'm sure you've seen that too, where they say, oh, people are becoming completely stupid because they don't think anymore. All the
Because
thinking
they
is
use
done by the
GPS and
smartphone.
yeah, yeah.
So we'll see. These are empirical questions, but I've seen speculations of all kinds. Some say that we will become super smart because of our smart things. So others say that the smart things will make us
Yes.
completely stupid.
Let's see.
One thing that actually is affected by this, sorry,
Yes.
is spatial ability,
Okay.
because now everybody uses a GPS. Which you can actually, I mean, you can on your phone, you put your phone in your car and it will
Hmm.
like drive you to your destination without much thinking, where you would have to, during driving, you would have to do some kind of spatial reasoning in your head to think about directions and
True.
so on. You don't have to do it anymore. Now, since my spatial ability is already awful, I'm very happy with that. I don't want to improve it. I'm happy if it declines even more. I'm happy with the GPS. But it is indeed true. That's something we don't do very often. Another thing that where there's, and that's just starting to take place, but there the
Hmm.
reasoning seems fair to me, because it's indeed the case that we don't. I mean, we used to engage most spatial reasoning while driving, and we don't do that anymore. Another thing which is actually demonstrably has taken place and type in effect is basic arithmetics. So
Hmm.
our grandparents were better at basic arithmetics, because if you look at what they did at math classes in school, they did a lot of basic arithmetics. These days, if you look at math problems, and some of them are just fluid reasoning problems.
Hmm.
You have to use inductive reasoning to solve them. You have to recognize patterns and so on. And you don't do very much mental arithmetics in school these days.
True.
So they change. These things
So they change.
change. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I do want to get back on norms, and I have a very interesting question for me because I'm working with quite a lot and I really like this game-based assessments, right? And some of them test cognitive abilities and mental abilities as well. Now, the way they work and the way they look at organizations, and I just want to understand how you see it, is, for example, they come in, right? They have an organization of 5,000 people. They tell us, look, give me your best 100 in sales or marketing or whatever. We will profile those 100. And then the next candidates that come in, we will benchmark them against your top 100, the mean that you have with the top 100. And then we will tell you who's good for the job or not. Is this enough? Because I somehow always feel that first you are looking at something that is already there. So if you want something better, whether it's personality or mental abilities or whatever, you're not getting it, right? Because you're sampling from a population that already exists. And second of all, it feels like it's too small of a sample, but it only feels like it. So I'm not sure how to look at it.
Okay. I think it again depends on your actual purpose for selection.
Hmm.
I mean, I've I'm not following this HR field
Hmm.
closely
Hmm.
anymore, but I used to work as expert in the personal selection, using psychological psychometric tests. Um, and in my experience, they were not very keen on having norms that represent the population. I mean, they were very
Hmm.
happy with norms based on only managers or only recent graduates, depending
Hmm.
on the job. So,
How did you feel about it? Because for me, that where I stand, I'm like, okay, I want someone better than I already have. So I would like to look at the entire population, understand where the population is, and then understand where my company is and what's better for me. Because if I only look at my population in the company, then I don't know what's better out there and where I am either.
No, that's an interesting question. It might be too HR specific for me, but it certainly is interesting. I mean, it's also a very costly decision to move out from a
Mm-hmm.
company. I mean, if you create new tests of cognitive abilities, the most expensive part is always the norming.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you have to administer tests to a representative sample of a population that a sample that's representative of the entire population, that's very, very costly.
True.
uh, and it's even worse if you do that for adults, which if you're in
Mm-hmm.
HR you need to do. I mean, if you norm it on children, it's still very, very costly. But it's at least you can, during office hours, it's a very easy thing to find children. They are, you know
Mm-hmm.
where they are. They are in the school, so it's very easy to find them. And then you already have to arrange with
Yeah, it's
schools
easier to have
and
access to
so on.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. But if it's adults, then it's tricky because then you go from 18 to 90 in terms of age
Mm-hmm.
and all levels of IQ. And since it's a representative sample, you have to involve all kinds of,
Mm-hmm.
all regions, all areas of the country, all types of settlements, and so on.
True.
And it's not, I mean, you certainly have a much easier job if you just want to create a norm based on your own company
Mm-hmm.
than if you take the task of having to find a female between 65 and 70 living in a rural village, having less education than high school, and convince her to take your test during the day or sometime. Like,
Okay.
it's methodologically much more challenging and it's much more costly. So, from the perspective of companies, uh, it might be better, as you said, but I think the first thing that would come to mind in the company is whether it's cost effective. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it might be better, but are the benefits really worth it?
So pretty much either go on something that already has norms like Ravens or Vectors or whatever,
Yeah.
or yeah,
Or
keep it keep it in
but
house.
my experience is that, I mean, what you said surprises me a little bit because in my short experience on this personal selection market, my experience was that these HR companies using tests are just happy with those. They didn't seem to me to need those norms. They were completely satisfied with, because they said, okay, we want to. This is a kind of job we want to select a manager, a mid-level manager,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's enough to compare the person to other mid-level managers. We don't want to compare the person to someone who hasn't even completed high school. Or they said, okay, this is a job where we're recruiting recent graduates. So we need the norm of recent graduates. We don't need a group with the 50
I,
year old.
I agree, but what's happening right now, it's they're not even comparing to the graduates, right, or the middle level managers. They're just comparing to the middle level managers or the graduates that are already in your company. So the sample is even smaller. So it gets, usually they are happy. So they say that they reach out to 100, but they're happy with 50.
Okay. Well,
So
if you outsource it, if you work
mhm,
at a company, you outsource it to a personal select to a company specialized in personal selection, they will probably have larger norms because they have. But again, my experience is that
yeah,
they keep adding the new data to the norms.
that should
So
happen, right?
they also have a norm only of mid managers,
Hmm.
but they will come from 8, 18, 28 different companies rather than
Hmm.
just one. So
Okay.
in terms of the wideness of the population, they're not any wider. They also focus on the same niche.
Okay.
That's your target as a selection professional. Um, but they will have at least a larger range of companies.
Yeah, yeah. I was more concerned with this game-based assessments, right? Whereas you don't have Ravens or Vexter, you just play some Tetris games and whatever, and then you get a score, right? And then it's they're quite interesting because apparently they measure behaviors and reasoning and all of that behind the screen, right? Some are quite interesting. I will send you some links if you want to see
I
how they
would be
look.
happy
It's
to. Yes.
quite interesting. So and that's I had a chat with several of them, implementing them for the companies that I worked for, and then that's what they do. So they want you to give them 100 people. If they get 50 to test, and then they can compare with that, which I don't find it wrong, but I find it limited. So yeah, I wanted to ask how someone else is viewing it.
That's interesting. That's also a rapidly emerging field, this
Yeah.
gamified testing, and most recent studies show that if you use game tests, or so like a number of games, especially if these are cognitive games,
Hmm.
and you extract the general factor from that, because we will find a positive and a
Yeah.
fault, then you can extract the general factor, and we find this game-based G to correlate quite strongly with test-based G.
Hmm.
So some people are super enthusiastic about this, that these boring psychometric tests will eventually be replaced by much more exciting games. Uh, but these are games. I mean, these are existing games. They were not designed for cognitive measurement. Um, on the other hand, there's an approach to gamify already existing tests, which is
Hmm.
not exactly the
True.
same. This is a really a new thing. I think I probably know more. I mean, I've seen these studies that use game G, and non-game G, and those are interesting. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the use of these in actual HR contexts, so you know more about that.
One of those that I really like and has a lot of research, and it's created by neuroscientists. Two of them is Pymetrics. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
No.
Have a look. Is PY metrics. It's very interesting how and I'm not sure if you can still play the game online, because I did it. It was free, so that's how they created their norms, because it was free and available for everyone to play, and it's 20 minutes, 12 games, something like this. So very very short as well, with quite interesting results.
Okay, I look
Yeah,
into.
I can send you a link. Yeah, those are from
Yeah, I
the ones
think
that I
it really
really
is the
like as
future.
research.
And I think it really should be the future, not only for adults, but also for children in educational
Hmm.
settings. Because one of the things you can really alleviate with these gamified tests is test anxiety. I mean, some children get
Yeah.
really super anxious when you sit down with them to take a cognitive reading test. And if you can keep playing games, then it's much more relaxed.
Yeah.
Also, so they can be tested without actually having the stress of being tested. Also, since these games can be longitudinal, so if you
Hmm.
administer a test and you've administered it, and if you want to administer a test, so if you want to follow up on the child like a year later or 6 months later, that's already challenging, because you cannot use the same test again, because
True.
there's some experience, some memory effects, practice effects. If you use another test, then there's a problem of parallelity, like how parallel is the test? Is the other test? Is it, and so on.
Yeah.
But with games, it's very easy, because it's not a one-time occasion. You can look at improvement, and then you can look at potential. Um, it's probably useful for children with disadvantaged background as well,
Hmm.
because even though their first result will not be not that good, you can, if they have potential, you can see an increase and so on. So I think that, yes, that I agree with you, that is the future probably of cognitive.
It's and indeed it's easier. You don't feel like you're applying for a job or you are being tested. You feel like you're playing, and you forget yourself into the games. You're just chasing a fish or whatever you are doing. Now, Christoph, let me ask you. There's a lot of talk right now that grit, like doing, learning, working hard, is way more important than intelligence. How should we look at this? If someone is in the average, right? But then it's a very, very hard working person putting all the effort in and all of that. Can this surpass? Can their performance be at the same level if they would have a higher IQ, or can it even surpass a performance of a person with a higher IQ because of this grit, because of this hard work? How should we look at it?
Yes, it's as you know, it's also quite controversial. So there's a lot of debate on this.
Hmm.
If you ask Frank Schmidt or others, they will say probably not, because the
Okay.
results show it's cognitive ability after all. Others, for instance, Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you've heard Jordan Peterson talk about grit, but someone gets him started on grit, then he gets really. His point is basically that it's a magician's trick. It's fake,
Mm-hmm.
because what's being done is it's the personal dimension conscientiousness repackaged and resold.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't want to take sides on that. I really am not.
Okay.
I'm on this grid thing, but yeah, I mean, people usually are motivated to believe that things matter that can be changed, that are flexible,
Mm-hmm.
malleable.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they are flexible, malleable, and it's only a matter of practice and hard work, then it just creates a nicer world, doesn't
Then
it?
they have control.
And they
Then
have
they can have
control.
control over
And
it.
if it's for instance, if Schmidt, Frank Schmidt is right, then general accountability matters most, and it's genetically based, then basically if it's you're doomed if
Mm-hmm.
it's no. So grit sort of is optimistic as an
Mm-hmm.
approach.
But on the other hand, he does correlate. So apparently, general cognitive ability with conscientiousness, if you put the two together, right, they predict performance way more than either of them alone. So I
Exactly.
think it's 0.78 versus 0.65 of 0.2 or something. It's very, very small personality
That's
itself.
that's without doubt, actually,
Mm-hmm.
that conscientiousness is a very good and independent predictor. So independent of cognitive
Mm-hmm.
ability. So hard work does matter. You can have very high abilities. If you're lazy and don't do anything, then you won't get far for sure. Um, so yes, conscientiousness and general mental ability are both very good predictors.
Mm-hmm.
The debate about which is more important, I don't know. I mean, if you look
Okay.
at the HR field, every now and then somebody comes up with a new concept, and they immediately contrast that with intelligence. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it already it was already the case with emotional intelligence. Actually,
That was my next question.
it
How do
was
we look
before
at
that.
this?
If you
Yes.
look at McClelland's paper, which I think came out in 1973,
Mm-hmm.
which had a title "Testing for Competence Rather than Intelligence." So not just, hey, we should test for competence. We should it's rather than, because intelligence is well established, and when somebody comes
Mm-hmm.
up with something new like competence or emotional
Yeah,
intelligence or social
personality or
intelligence
whatever.
or
Yeah.
grit, they immediately, and that's my experience or my impression, immediately contrast it with intelligence and say, yeah, this is more important than intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of debate, and it turns out it might not be more important, but it's important nonetheless. Competency is an exception, because that's a matter of approach as well.
Mm-hmm.
Competency takes a top-down approach. It starts out from what you need to do the job right, and then it's a top-down thing, and then you try to define this competency. But competency is a behavioral kind of definition
Mm-hmm.
for doing the job right, which whatever it is that makes you do
The
the
job
job
right.
right.
Yeah.
What Frenchman does is more like a bottom-up kind of thing. So you have
Mm-hmm.
these things like consciousness, and so on, intelligence, and so on, and look at each as individual predictors of performance. But if so, competency is somewhat different because of its approach. But if you just look at things like emotional intelligence, grit, and so on, they're always something that immediately enter the field by saying, "Hey, I'm better than intelligence."
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I don't want to say if it's better or not. The better question would have been, can an average intelligence be increased by hard work? Can performance of someone who has average intelligence be increased by hard work, right? Because it feels like it's intelligence or IQ or whatever predicts performance, right, up to a certain level. And then if that person is also conscientious, right, or has grit or whatever we want to call it, would they perform better than someone who has a high level of intelligence but is not putting in the hard work? So can we somehow add to this rather than, I don't want to contrast them, but can we
Okay,
Have a bit of control.
I think what it was, there are two different things. One was,
I hope we have a bit of control, actually.
yeah. So basically, I think these are two different questions. One is
Okay.
whether intelligence can be improved or increased
True. True.
by hard work.
Hmm.
The other is whether intelligence can be compensated by hard work.
Hmm.
Basically, that's what you said. So
Yes.
even if I have read abilities, those are different questions, and it's important. I mean,
Okay.
in one case, you say that your hard work eventually results in your intelligence increasing. The
Hmm.
other says, well, no matter what you do, your intelligence is the same, but you can compensate for that with hard work.
Hmm.
I mean, for the second one, we do have an answer, and that's from even from the GTs. You can, yes, and especially
Hmm.
there's some kind of asymptote or threshold level. I don't know how to call it, but as I said, if you don't do anything, I mean, if you're very non-conscientious, then you won't get far. Uh, so hard work does matter, and hard work and consciousness are independent predictors
Hmm.
of success, independent of intelligence. So for sure, yeah. I mean, these
So
are
they add
important,
a
and you
lot.
can compensate a lot.
Hmm.
Whether in this process your intelligence will increase is it's not that easy. I mean, I think most evidence
Hmm.
today shows probably not.
Okay. So if someone, because we are preaching a lot of development on, hey, you have never, right, you've been in the same type of job, maybe you haven't worked with people too much, but get yourself into these new situations in which you'll be able to learn, interact more with people, go to meetups, present something in front of people and all of that, and you will increase your competence, your skill, your behavior, and you will be just be better. Does it work? Does it increase? Does, because at some point it will require change, right? It will
It co-
require that fluidity of intelligence.
Most
Or
competencies can be increased. I mean, especially
okay.
social ones. You can teach people a lot of things, like how to present the
Hmm.
result, from how to present the results to how to be effective managers. I mean, surely these things can be trained. When it comes to hardcore cognitive abilities, that's more controversial whether that is the
Okay.
case. And if it's hardcore basic personality trait, that's also not that easy. I mean, you
Okay.
cannot make someone. It's hard to make someone much more extroverted. If someone's really introverted and doesn't enjoy being in the center of attention, and prefers sitting at home Saturday evening reading a book than going to a party, then it's really hard to make that person all of a sudden enjoy being in the center of attention.
Hmm.
You can make them handle situations where, I mean, most
You can get them
introverts,
to the party, but it doesn't mean that they will
yeah,
enjoy it.
exactly. You can get into parties, and most introverts actually have to sort of force themselves to
Hmm.
be social extroverts, as they say. So they because if you're I mean, you cannot, if you're
Hmm.
if you're an extreme introvert, it's really hard to unless you're doing a kind of job where you do at home all day, writing code or something like that. But if you work with people in teams, then it's really tough.
Okay.
But so apart from cognitive abilities and very basic core personality traits, a lot of things can be trained without doubt, and
Okay.
most competences probably can.
That's still good news. You were talking about emotional intelligence, and I wanted to talk to you about it. Is it one of the mental abilities? Is it just a term like, I don't know, Swarovski's crystals? It's just a crystal. We gave it a name, and here it is. It's a nice something pink that we can all be attracted to. Because for me, interpersonal relations, being able to communicate, relate to people, is the same one as having this emotional intelligence. Is it just another coin of this term, or is it actually an intelligence?
Yes, people who argue that this is an intelligence argue that there's a lot of cognitive stuff involved
Hmm.
so if you look at tests of emotional intelligence, some involve, it's a multifaceted construct, so it also has components. And one of the components actually of emotional intelligence is to recognize emotions in the first place,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's kind of cognitive. There's a lot of research and a lot of cognitive measuring instruments, like for instance the eye test, where you look at eyes, just the eyes, or
Mm-hmm.
in other versions, full faces of people, and you have to recognize their emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's an ability to recognize emotional states, and then emotional intelligence, presumably as a construct, involves not only recognizing those emotions, it's a necessary prerequisite, but also to deal with them and adapt to other people's emotional states and react accordingly. It also involves, according to the concept, recognizing one's own emotional states.
Mm-hmm.
We all know people in the workplace that otherwise who are very not aware of what emotional state they express around themselves. So uh, yeah, I often say that there are some people walking around with a face as if you just flushed their goldfish down the toilet, and they are not aware of the way they look. So that's emotional intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
presumably also to be aware
Of
uh,
yourself.
of yourself, like your own emotions and how others might perceive you, and so on. So there's an argument. There's a lot of it's not just it's and there's empathy involved, of course, but it's not. People who defend the construct emotional intelligence
Mm-hmm.
often say that it's not the correct interpretation, but critics of emotional intelligence often say that, oh, it's just being nice and empathic. It's not. Actually, being nice is more or less manifested in the or represented in the personal trait agreeableness.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
True.
but regardless, I mean, it's emotional intelligence. People who work with this construct keep emphasizing it's not just being empathic,
Mm-hmm.
being nice to others. It has a lot of cognitive components. This is not.
So
I mean, I've read about emotional intelligence, but it's not
yeah.
my narrow field, so I can't do justice. I don't even offer. To be honest, a very extremely well-read opinion.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of research about emotional intelligence that I'm not aware
Mm-hmm.
of, but generally speaking, those who argue that it's an intelligence highlight the cognitive aspects of the construct.
Okay. So you would say, hey, still look at it as an intelligence, and then we see where it takes us, rather than just dismissing it as yeah, a simple competence like empathy or yeah, interpersonal skills or communication or anything else.
I'll be frank with you.
It's more
I
complex
find
rather than so simple.
yeah, I'll be frank with you. I find the question of whether to call something an intelligence or not rather boring, to be honest. And I found
Okay.
that already with gardeners. I mean, people, if intelligence seems to be a good brand,
Mm-hmm.
so
It
people
is.
invent something they want to call it intelligence, which is funny because the very same people often criticize intelligence.
So
So
how
if
should we call it?
I don't know. I'm just saying. For instance, if you look at Goldman's book, it
Mm-hmm.
criticizes intelligence test thoroughly and the concept of intelligence thoroughly. He regardless calls the concept emotional intelligence. It doesn't
Intelligence.
call it emotional ability. So intelligence, apparently, the word or the brand intelligence has apparently some market value if you want to sell your ID. Um, I don't want to take sides on whether it's okay
Okay.
to call emotional intelligence. I don't, to be honest, I don't think that's super
I
fascinating.
yeah, that's not even what I'm asking. Honestly, it's more
Okay,
like,
okay.
okay, we shouldn't look at it as a simple concept, but more complex, where some cognitive abilities are involved, and that's it. Whether yeah, it's called emotional ability, agility, intelligence. That's and I know some would argue with me, because apparently having a well-defined construct is really good from
Ye-
theoretical perspective
Yeah, it
and research
overlaps.
perspective.
Yeah, it overlaps. Essentially, on these cognitive aspects of emotional intelligence overlap with a lot of things in cognitive psychology, but they are not the same as fluid intelligence or
Mhm.
crystalline intelligence or other things usually called intelligence. For
Mhm.
instance, the eye test that I mentioned is used extensively in a field of cognitive psychology that's called theory of mind.
Mhm.
It's a theory of mind refers to our ability to attribute beliefs and desires to other people. And there's a theory that people living with autism lack this
Mhm.
ability. So these eye tests that made its way to emotional intelligence tests had been used before that for theory of mind research and for research in autism. So that's the cognitive part, but it's
Yeah.
not the same cognitive part as like number series or
Yes, definitely. Definitely it's different. I
yeah, yeah.
was just,
So
yeah,
so I don't want to take sides on that. I'm sorry if I'm not giving a satisfactory answer,
it's
but
perfect.
I think the argument is compelling that there is a cognitive
Mhm.
side to this, but still it's different from what they people
It's
usually
perfect
like.
because it gives people a new way to look into it, or at least a new that, hey, I still need to research this, and this is an area that I need to look into. Christoph, I know the time is coming towards an end, and we booked 2 hours. So, what's next in your research? What's I know you told me that lately you have been thinking about the applications and psychometrics for your theory. Is it all? Are you doing anything else?
Yes,
What's next?
but actually, yeah, it's like a surprising answer. I mean, this theories was published 3 years ago, so it's still doing a lot of follow up. It has a
Hmm.
number of predictions which are being tested. So currently, both my collaborator and I we're applying grants to test the theory, different predictions. Some have already been published.
Hmm.
So basically, we will get keep us engaged for some time to come. And apart from that, I'm involved in a number of things regarding cognitive abilities. That I mentioned the Woodcock-Johnson ability
Hmm.
tests. They are just being adapted and standardized in Hungary, adapted to Hungarians in Hungary, and I'm involved with that.
Hmm.
Um, I 2 years ago, I created an adaptive, computerized adaptive test of fluid reasoning, similar to Ravens. It's also matrix reasoning. So a number of different. I mean, it centers around
Intelligence
concepts
related,
over theory, but a number of different things on cognitive abilities.
cognitive abilities related. Okay. And how can people follow your work or the work that you and others are doing at the university or other of your colleagues on cognitive abilities? Is there a site? Is there
Actually, I moved universities relatively recently, so a new lab is being established. So
okay?
hopefully, a few months from now, there will be a lab website. Currently, to be honest, it's gonna be hard. But I'm a Google scholar.
Okay.
Well, that's one. But that's what how I usually follow other people's research.
Hmm.
I set notifications in on Google Scholar for people who I follow for their research to I mean to get notifications when
Hmm.
the new papers come out. So Google Scholar is
Google
one.
Scholar.
Yeah, I would say probably. Yeah, and there's gonna be a proper lab website in a few months.
Perfect. Now I found the whole issue of your with your research and then the different discussions online, and it was free. Is it okay if I share a link when I share the podcast, or
Yeah,
that's okay?
sure. Thank you.
It's online and free, right? I first came across it on Deep Dive, so a paid research database. But then I just did a search with your name, and then the whole issue came up as a free PDF with all the discussions on it, pro and con.
I'm happy for people to read my papers, free
Mhm.
or not. It's not me you have to convince. It's the publisher. So, uh,
I imagine
it's
someone. I think it's actually from the publisher that it's online. So I'll have a
yeah,
look.
yeah, yeah. There are a few that are online
Yeah,
actually. But as I said, it's even if it's not, it's a matter of. I mean, I'm not. It's not of my concern. It's the publishers, to be honest.
cool.
I mean, a colleague of mine once said that we academics want eyes. That's our currency. We don't want money. We want eyes on our papers. So yeah,
Perfect. Christoph, I cannot thank you enough for your time today and for all the explanations and all the knowledge you've shared with me and with everyone.
thank you so much for inviting me, and
Thank
thank you
you.
for the opportunity.
Thank you. And then I'll send you a link and everything so you can know when it's out and all of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Bye.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice
Bye.
afternoon. Bye
Bye.
bye.